Hello, and welcome to our live broadcast. I'm here tonight with Gwynn Wallace, and Gwynn is a fellow physiotherapist, so I'm really happy to be chatting with somebody who hopefully we talk the same language, Gwynn, with any luck.
Hopefully.
So thank you for joining me. You're a member of the Royal Air Force, and currently you are working with people who struggle post-COVID, and your specialism is in breathing rehabilitation and dysfunctional breathing. And you know, it's a bit of anathema, the idea that breathing, something so automatic, could potentially be well, I suppose, unless you're asthmatic, of course.
Yeah.
You know, I never was. But yeah, something so automatic as breathing.
It's one of the things that, despite the fact that we think of breathing as being automatic, actually, it's something we do have conscious control over. And the first thing any of my patients, where I say, right, I think you have dysfunctional breathing pattern, the first reaction they go is, yeah, I'm breathing all right. And that tends to be, so that there's quite a bit of general skepticism about the fact of, why are you talking to me about my breathing? Because I can walk, I can do things. Yes, I get a bit short of breath, but that's normal. That's normal because I've had COVID, or that's normal because I'm not as fit as I should be. So there's a lot of symptoms in there where people just find it difficult to accept. 10% of the population have a dysfunctional breathing pattern. So it's actually a lot more common than people think it is.
So what might constitute a dysfunctional breathing pattern?
It's actually something that is actually not the most efficient way of doing it. It manifests itself in lots of different ways. What I'm going to state a claim. I am a nasal breathing fascist. For me, nasal breathing is the way to go forward. What you find with people who have dysfunctional breathing is it tends to be very, very energy demanding, because basically what people don't do is they don't use the right pieces of kit to actually help them with their breathing. Typically, we're talking in terms of, they tend to use a lot of their neck and shoulders as their primary mechanism for breathing, rather than their diaphragm. And that in itself, so in essence, it's just a very energy intense way of breathing.
Yeah, well, this is something that I'm familiar with, the notion that nasal breathing is more efficient, but also has a capacity to influence the central nervous system a bit more, perhaps.
Yeah.
You're nodding. Oh, I'm glad you're nodding.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's you think today we're a lot more in tune around things around yoga and meditation and mindfulness, and you think, and a lot of the things they talk about is very much about controlling your breath. You know, and that whole thing, in terms of, by controlling your breath, what you're doing is you're influencing the autonomic system. One of the things about being an apical breather, so somebody who uses their top part of their chest for their breathing, is they tend to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, which is that fight or flight system. Whereas doing the diaphragmatic breathing, so breathing from low down into your ribs, actually stimulates and helps modify the parasympathetic, or the rest and digest part of the system. So in simplistic terms, that whole thing around focusing around your breathing and trying to get away from this pattern to this pattern is actually what helps destimulate, if you like.
Yeah, so it is interesting, that, isn't it? Because, like you said, the sympathetic nervous system, our fight or flight, actually causes us to breathe in that kind of a way. And yet when we breathe in that way, it has that feedback loop back to the system. So it's this kind of cyclical thing, isn't it? And so anxiety can create that situation where the sympathetic nervous system is heightened awareness, and we're breathing apically, and it's, you know, kind of sending us round in this circle.
And there are very, very good physiological reasons why this has happened. Because at the end of the day, this is an adaptive response. This is something that is part of our physiology in terms of that whole fight or flight thing. And to be honest, a lot of the reason why this is happening, why it's becoming more frequent, is because of modern life. Modern life is more stressful by its very, very nature. Now, one of the things that I talk about when I do have sort of like patients with dysfunctional breathing is that whole rationale for why the fight or flight system actually evolved, because it did evolve, and what's happened now in terms of that, what's called a general adaptive state. And the analogy I use is saber-tooth tigers.
Okay.
Because from an evolutionary perspective, the whole fight or flight is we either need to run away from something, or we're running after something to get some food. So imagine a saber-tooth tiger, you get the stress response, which basically changes your breathing rate, changes your heart rate and all the rest of it, so that you can then do an activity. What that does in terms of your blood chemistry is actually you are getting rid of the carbon dioxide, because you're going to then need to do something that produces carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is poison, as we know. So if you've got too much of that in your system, then basically you fall over and you become saber-tooth tiger food. So it's a really, really simple analogy of why it evolved. Now you come forward into society, we have that constant stress, which then blows off all the carbon dioxide, but we then don't do the activity that helps restore that homeostasis and that balance. And our bodies are really, really clever at developing ways to cope with that. And they do that by using a number of different physiological systems, which I won't go into because my physiology was never that good. But in essence, we've got a number of different systems that we use to actually bring our blood pH back to a normal level. And that has consequences. And then that's when you start to see a whole biochemical cascade of things that then result in patients having symptoms. Yeah.
Well, and this is something that I did mention, that I am a woman of a certain age, and that menopause is a time when we have physiological changes, and unexplained anxiety is something that people report, and indeed I did experience. And so, this idea that we're feeling anxious, we don't even really know why, but we're going to have those physiological responses to that. And as you say, unless we're running around, shifting that biochemistry, then it really can have quite a negative effect.
Yeah. And to be honest, women suffer that effect even premenopausal. That whole estrogen, progesterone balance with the monthly cycle, or before, when you go into that PMT cycle, the nature of the hormones that you have in your system mean that you breathe more.
I'm panting.
In terms of your breathing rate increases because of the hormone levels.
Okay, so that's
one of the reasons why, actually, in terms of you look at the incidence of dysfunctional breathing among men and women, and tends to be more women, and they tend to notice some of their symptoms around that time, around PMT. So whilst you've got the whole menopausal thing, actually it's something that you can be subject to a long time before that. And one of the things that from a physio perspective, particularly if you've got women who have joint hypermobility, one of the questions that I will ask them in terms of, do you get more back pain around PMT, etc., etc.? Because one of the effects is you have less stability. Basically, your pattern of breathing changes, so you have less dynamic stability, which means those joints are having to work harder. So there's a whole cascade of other things that you may not think are necessarily involved that the breathing will have an effect on.
Yeah, well, that's it. And that's fascinating. I knew my menopause was playing me like a fiddle, but PMT, I had that as well. So what are the consequences? I suppose dysfunctional breathing, did we describe the kinds of symptoms that you might experience? Like somebody said to me once that things like coughing, a sort of throat clearing, or other sort of symptoms.
There are some throat related type conditions that can evolve, but not specifically. There are a whole catalogue, a range of symptoms that we use as both diagnostic tests, but actually just to get people to recognise that they have these issues. You know, excuse me, stuff like chest pain. Chest pain is quite common in dysfunctional breathing. Feeling tense, blurred vision, brain fog. So in other words, that inability to be able to think clearly or concisely. One of the things about the whole patterns of over breathing is because you are blowing off too much carbon dioxide, what that then does is reduce the blood flow to the thinking areas of the brain. Because what it does is to go into fight or flight mode and basically make sure the blood center gets to the more primitive sides of the brain rather than the thinking part of it. So that whole thing in terms of the cognitions, not to think clearly, struggling to find words, are all part of that brain fog. Feeling bloated, so gastro GI type symptoms, because again you've got that whole thing around sort of like when the blood, when basically your blood becomes more acidic, what happens is some of the peripheral circulation shuts down, and that includes going to things like your gut, because it goes into that I need to protect myself mode. Really basic ones that are obvious, like that inability to be able to breathe deeply.
Okay.
So they can't get a full and satisfying type breath is a really, really common one. Other ones, palpitations, feeling anxious. You know, and we have, from a physio perspective, we have a couple of little questionnaires that we use to help us diagnose that in patients. And the beauty of them is, A, they're really quick, and they give a really good indication of where you are on your dysfunctional breathing journey. So we can put a link into those later if you want. I can send you links and you can add those to it, because they are really available. You know, if you do a Google, basically called the Nijmegen questionnaire, like in in Holland, and the self-efficacy breathing questionnaire. They're two really, really simple ones that if you do a Google search, you can find it. And there's pretty good guides about what that actually means if you score over a particular score on either of those tests.
Okay. Yeah, because I think there's, you know, lots of people would be experiencing this phenomenon without knowing it, is the thing. And, you know, and a lot of the symptoms that you mentioned can be grouped in with other conditions, like, you know, fibromyalgia for one, fatigue, you know, brain fog, all of this. So there's elements of this potentially that that could be disguised in other conditions.
There was a doctor called Claude Lum who first identified dysfunctional breathing as an issue, and his article is called Tip of the Iceberg, because what it was identifying was the fact there are one or two key symptoms that actually hide a whole wealth of stuff. Another gentleman called the Untitled talked about the fact that these were the typical fact file patients who will go to a doctor with one of these symptoms, say the chest pain. So they'll go with chest pain, and the first reaction of the doctor is to send them to see a cardiologist. The cardiologist will do all of those tests, and they all come back negative. So then you'll mention some other symptom. So say you mention the fact you can't breathe properly. So you'll go and see a respiratory specialist consultant. And what you end up with is this big file of all these investigations with nothing that's been found, when actually the underpinning issue around this is dysfunctional breathing.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a feature, isn't it, of people with symptoms that are common to lots of different conditions, and they travel around different experts and specialisms. And so really looking at people in the broadest sense, in a holistic fashion. And, you know, I mean, obviously, as an MSK, musculoskeletal physio, I get people who come with, you know, chest pain, rib pain. And I must confess that dysfunctional breathing hasn't necessarily been on my list of things to consider, but I mean, it sounds like it probably should be.
I always come back to, I don't know if I've already mentioned it already, it is breathing is the first and the last thing we do. It is intimately linked with every single activity we do, whether that be as being awake or being asleep. You know, how our diaphragm works in association with other muscles gives us our stability, our dynamic stability. When you lift your arm, the tension in your diaphragm changes accordingly to make you more stable. Everybody thinks the diaphragm is just this sheet of muscle goes up and down and sucks air in. It's actually got a lot more function in terms of what it actually does for us. You know, if the anatomy of the diaphragm itself, it goes into a big dome, and at the back it blends into a central tendon, which actually blends into 3 levels of your low back. So it's an important support structure of your low back directly. You know, and people develop strategies that actually take the diaphragm completely out of the equation. Going back to the women's health, that whole idea of we've got a diaphragm at the top and we have the pelvic floor at the bottom. These 2 muscles work together to give you stability. And if one is dysfunctional, you can bet your bottom dollar the other one is as well. And this is, again, how breathing can have a massive impact in terms of women's health, around pelvic floor stability and all those kind of issues. You know, if you're not dealing with the diaphragm at the top, you're certainly going to have issues with the diaphragm at the bottom. Yeah.
And that, I totally appreciate that relationship. I think it's so fascinating, I must confess. But let's go on to talk a little bit about our COVID situation we've got going on at the minute, because, you know, COVID obviously is a respiratory condition, and so this what we're finding is that people are suffering long after the COVID has, the acute part of the illness is resolved.
Yeah.
And so what would you say about this?
We've been treating COVID patients now since May last year. We've seen over 120 patients doing residential care. The vast majority, those 2 questionnaires that I mentioned, 90% of our patients have issues with dysfunctional breathing.
And this is post-COVID we're talking?
90% of them. On the normal course that we run basically a medically based musculoskeletal course to help people get back onto track and back into work within the military. That's normally at 50%. 50% of them will have an element of dysfunctional breathing. The COVID rehab course we're running at the moment, we are running at 90% of them have some element of dysfunctional breathing as part of their issues. You know, and you talk about the symptoms that they're experiencing, because one of the biggest elements we do is we talk about breathing education. And we talk about their COVID symptoms, and then I talk about the dysfunctional breathing symptoms. And the striking similarity between both sets of those symptoms really strikes a chord with the patients, because they can see, yes, COVID has an impact, but it's also changed how I move and breathe and work, and therefore that's also having an impact. So that demystification and saying, yes, COVID has been bad, and yes, you've had some physiological effects in terms of your chest infection, etc., but however, what you've now got is something else that's overlaying on the top, and we need to address that to help you go forward. And that really helped deal with some of their anxieties, because obviously anxiety feels into their dysfunctional breathing.
Well, that's right. Yeah, exactly. So if you're worrying about whatever's going on, we talked a bit about health anxiety before, didn't we? The idea that we worry about our health actually just feeds into that whole cycle of downward spiral.
And we're all in such a bizarre situation at the moment. You know, nothing is normal.
No.
Back last year, we were talking about the new normal. We still don't know what new normal is going to look like. We still can't have those social interactions that we are used to. So there is a background of our overall stress levels are heightened anyway. And then you've got, the whole aim of military rehab is to get people back to an occupational status. These guys and girls are wondering, are they ever going to get back to that status? Which in itself feeds into that anxiety about where they are. And that's essentially why we run an early intervention course. We're trying to demedicalize them, reassure them that this is normal and that you can get better.
Yeah, and that's so important for anyone out there. And this was why I thought it was such an opportunity for you to spread the word about the kind of work that you are doing for these people, because we give hope and reassurance, and that there are things that people can do, and some of them are relatively simple.
Massively so. You know, one of the things I say to all the patients that we have on the course is that I'm going to give you one exercise as a physio, and this one exercise is the easiest exercise you're ever going to get from a physio anywhere. But you've got to do a series of activities before that to be able to do that exercise. Okay. And it's basically called beach pose breathing. So it's lying on your back with your hands behind your head.
What did you say?
Beach pose breathing, literally beach pose breathing. So lying on your back, hands behind your head with your knees bent, just trying to breathe through your nose.
Okay.
But to do that, you've got to do a series of activities to try and get your upper back and rib cage to be more mobile. One of the problems we have with the modern life is we're not as mobile. So therefore, it takes 20 minutes of a joint not moving to stiffen up. If we become increasingly sedentary, the spine and therefore the rib cage is going to be less compliant. It's going to have that less ability to be able to move. So we get them to do that and recognize the difference between their normal state as they become and the fact that that rib cage should be going like that. Okay? We then get them to do the beach pose breathing.
Right.
And within a week, they feel the differences. And the thing is, this is one of the beauties of this thing. It is literally foam rolling, getting your ribs mobile, beach pose breathing, and breathing through this and not this.
Yeah.
Right? This is for speaking, eating, drinking. It is not for breathing.
So just for anybody who's listening to the audio version on the podcast, which we're going to release later, Gwyn's pointing to his nose for breathing, and then he's pointing to his mouth for, what did you say, eating, drinking?
Eating, drinking, and breathe. Because at the end of the day, one of this I've got this handout which is interesting facts about breathing through your nose, and one of the bottom one on it is you can't kiss somebody and breathe at the same time unless you're using your nose. It's impossible unless you're breathing through your ears. You have to use your nose to kiss somebody and breathe at the same time. So no other reason. There's one good reason to learn to breathe through your nose.
That's the best reason, and we've only just passed Valentine's Day. What a shame.
But one of the things around the whole mouth breathing, nasal breathing debate, for want of a better expression, particularly the time of COVID, is if you're breathing through your mouth, you have no defense systems to protect your lungs. The nose warms air, it humidifies it, it filters it. The mucus traps snot, the mucus traps particles and bacteria and all the rest of it. The little tubations in your nose, little curves, all the rest of it, produce nitrous oxide. The nitrous oxide is one of the most fundamental things that is only now starting to be understood. It's antiviral. Okay, it's an antiviral system. Antiviral. They're using nitrous oxide in the treatment of COVID-19. They're looking at it's being trialed. They've been using sort of external nitrous oxide to help these patients deal with it. You actually have your own nitrous oxide system. It's called your nose.
In your nose.
And the thing about using it is it's an organ. It's like any other organ or system. The more you use it, the better it gets at doing it. Okay. And the other thing about that nitrous oxide is it's a bronchodilator. So it actually opens up your airways. It's also a vasodilator, so it opens up your blood vessels. So the more you, and this is the bit for me coming away from COVID, this is the bit for me in terms of from rehab to performance. If you can get access to these systems and you can actually start using the bases of your lungs rather than your apices, because one of the things about, if everybody just breathes through their mouths and just put one hand on your chest, one hand on your tummy and breathe through your mouth, do a few breaths breathing through your mouth.
Yeah.
And then close your mouth, breathe through your nose, and feel the difference, how those two systems work.
Yeah, it's very different, actually.
Yeah, because one of the things about it, yes, you can take big volumes in through your mouth, but all you're doing is you're putting air into the top part of your lungs. If you're breathing through your nose, yes, the volumes are slower, but you're taking them deeper into your lungs.
So is this something to do with the fact that the openings are narrowed and it creates a bit of back pressure, which is that it? Yeah.
It's essentially what you're doing is from a physio perspective is you're creating PEEP.
PEEP, what was it? Expiratory
airways pressure. So in essence, what you're developing is your own CPAP system. And you think about the stuff in terms of, mouth breathing can have potentially a whole series of consequences in terms of sleep apneas, particularly at night. I always used to joke about, yes, I used to snore and I used to get rib pain because I used to get
an elbow.
But there's quite a bit of evidence out now there in terms of mouth breathing and sleep apneas and cardiac issues. There is a growing body of evidence around it. So again, it's one of these consequences that people don't think that nasal breathing is really a really powerful tool. The other thing around that is that if you think in terms of from a physiological perspective and how your lungs work, because of gravity, all the blood tends to be in the bases. If you're mouth breathing, you're putting lots of air into the top and not a lot into the bases. If you're nasal breathing, you're getting more air down into those bases for longer, so it has more time to do gas exchange. So actually it's a more efficient, energy efficient way of breathing. And this is really important, particularly with the COVID patients, because one of the biggest element, the second issue that they're saying is that they have a problem with is shortness of breath and fatigue. So when you're trying to deal with patients where fatigue is a dominant thing and you're seeing their shoulders go up and down because they're breathing through here, those shoulders are doing 20 to 30,000 contractions a day, more than they need to.
Oh, yeah. You said something about that. How many breaths a day?
20 to 30,000 breaths a day you take.
20 to 30.
On your breathing rate.
Yeah. Well, that's quite a big difference, actually, isn't it? But to think that for 20,000 shoulder lifts, oh gosh, that's exhausting to think of, actually.
But then from an MSK perspective, you think about people when they're getting neck and shoulder pain or they're getting headaches. How many of those symptoms are becoming basically these muscles that are designed for movement are actually being used in the wrong way. Your diaphragm is fatigue resistant muscle. It's like your heart. It doesn't get tired. These bad boys do. So I say to my patients, do you get home and do you feel like a honey monster? And you go, yes. Because basically they're working so hard just doing day-to-day activities. You look at how that's contributing to the fatigue and logically it's going to have a massive impact.
Massive. I hadn't really, the thing I keep wanting to say to you while we're talking about this is that you and I have both got jobs where we talk a lot.
Yeah, sorry.
No. I'm happy for you to talk a lot, but it means that you can't breathe through your nose because you're talking all the time. So
there is a pretty story about this.
Okay.
One of the things about people who have dysfunctional breathing patterns is what you find is they go and that is again something you see with people who are stressed. You think about your stressed people, what you find is they do a deep in breath and then they send and then they do a recovery breath and then they send. So that's one of the things that you should be able to breathe and talk at the same time. One of the tools that I used, particularly when I still worked at the NHS, was books, children's books.
Okay. Books, as in books.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Because the thing about children's books is their punctuation is to allow you to breathe.
Yes.
I could read Horrid Henry to my son because the sentence structure was such that it was simple, but it meant that I could use the punctuation to get my breathing. I couldn't read Harry Potter without getting short of breath. Because the sentence structure is so much more complicated, and it's difficult to find where you're going to get your breaths in. So consequently, I was on send. Send. No.
So doing things like that will fuel those patterns then, I'm guessing. Is that what
you will fuel it? But it's a really good it's a really good assessment tool. And it's a really good treatment tool to see where you are on the journey. You know, sometimes what I'll do is I'll get a patient to read a book out loud just to watch and see how they cope with actually delivering something.
Okay, and that then is a reflection of how far along this journey they are.
Very much.
So so I've got that there, introduction to basic breathing. I know we've talked about the apices, the tops of the lungs. We've talked about the diaphragm. You know, are there any simple things that you could talk us through? Any simple techniques? Or
the first thing is to just look at that awareness. So one of the things we do is the high-low test, which is basically put one hand on your chest and one hand on your tummy, and just look at that pattern of breathing. You know, is it all coming from the chest? Is some of it coming from the chest and some of it coming from the belly? You know, what is that relationship between the two? Do you have a look at yourself in the mirror, and do you see your neck and shoulder muscles get tight as you breathe in? Is there a difference between when you're breathing through your mouth and when you breathe through your nose? Does breathing through your nose feel normal? If it doesn't feel normal, then you need to work on it. And the whole part about doing nasal breathing is that it's messy, because like any kind of exercise, if you go to the gym or you start walking or whatever, you get a kickback in that your muscles are sore, etc., etc. Because of the increased airflow going through your nose, you're going to produce more snot.
Snot?
Snot. There's no other way to describe it. You produce more snot. And the simple factor of the fact you are getting more air going in and out through that nose. And because of that, that stimulates the goblet cells that produce that snot. But what happens is, as you get used to that, that becomes less. Sorry.
This is a huge can of worms you're opening here.
It's a massive one. And it gets even worse. It gets even worse when you actually start getting people to do nasal breathing with walking. Okay. Because it's one thing to do it now when you're sat down and you're comfortable and relaxed. It's another issue to do it when you're walking around. What you will find is that people will start off by saying, I feel that I'm not getting enough air in. I've got air hunger. I need to take a deep breath because I feel like I'm panicking. I feel like I'm choking. I'm just not getting enough air in. And that's part of the fact that all the sort of nerve endings are used to being stimulated, and all of a sudden that's stopped. So that's going to kick off your flight or fight. So that's another thing just to be aware of. One of the things I say with the elite athletes that we worked with within the military is that the thing around you doing or learning to do nasal breathing is that it gets very messy, particularly outdoors, particularly in winter, because again, you think about that whole cold air. One of the jobs is to warm that air up, so that reaction is even worse. So yes, it gets more snotty. You are not going to want to be going around kissing people after you've been for a run just using nasal breathing, because it isn't pretty at all, and you do produce a lot of snot. But it does get better, and actually it improves your performance. One of my colleagues that I did a breathing training session with a group of physios and exercise rehab instructors. He called me in the cafe literally 2 days ago, and he's a triathlete. And one of the things he said was that he's finding it really difficult to do the running, but on his bike, when he goes onto his aero bars, when he gets into the tuck position, what he's noticed is actually pedal strokes are actually a lot smoother, and he's actually pedaling much more quality and much more speed because he's actually using nasal breathing. But this takes months and months to learn. You know, so for any of you out there that are struggling with dysfunctional breathing and you want to get more active, it's not going to happen in the next few weeks, but it's certainly a fantastic goal to have in terms of improving your overall physical and mental health well-being, because it will have an impact.
Yeah, and it's increasingly something that I'm aware of. And I know I can't remember the name of the person that was extolling the virtues of nasal breathing with Dr. Chatterjee on his podcast not very long ago.
Oh, Chris Evans. Chris Evans has been going on about it, apparently. So I've been.
Chris Evans goes on about everything.
He does like to go on about his breathing, but
well, yeah. So somebody was telling me he signed up to do, his wife's signing him up to do an ultra marathon. So let's see if he can breathe through his nose all the way through that one.
But you look at some of the top athletes and you will see that, you know, I mean, the classic example I use is look at, oh gosh, what was his name? Paula Radcliffe.
Oh yeah.
Paula Radcliffe at the end of her marathon when she was a good runner, but she wasn't an elite runner. And you look at her breathing pattern and her poor form when she was fatigued, and look at how that improved. She still had some of the mannerisms in terms of the head nod, but she was actually a lot more stable in terms of what she was doing. And that was because she improved her capacity in terms of how she was doing the running. And
with that, and are you saying she embraced nasal breathing?
I couldn't say because I didn't coach her or anything else like that, but one thing that is particularly noticeable, when the breathing rate goes up to a level that you can't control it, then the wheels start to come off when you lose that control.
Yeah, well, certainly I know I've tried it for myself, and I get to a point where I just have to sort of start to puff and pant through my mouth. But I suppose it's like anything, it's a skill, it takes practice. And the other thing, you know, you start to talk about breathing to some people and it just sets them into a spin, just to even talk about the notion of bringing breath under your conscious control. Now, I was a singer and have been a singer through my life. And so why are you laughing at that?
because generally singers and people who do woodwind and brass instruments are the worst for it.
Do you know what? I played the clarinet as well.
The number of times I've had people say, yes, I know about my diaphragm because I've been taught professional singing. And it's actually what they do is they use a slightly different technique, to be fair.
So all I was going to say was that the notion of breathing in a particular order, or, you know, the idea that you sing, 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 breathe, I suppose that is potentially dysfunctional, isn't it? Sing, 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 breathe. Sorry.
Yeah, it's another pattern, you know, there is a whole spectrum of what dysfunctional breathing is. In its most originally, the origins of dysfunctional breathing, it was called hyperventilation syndrome.
Oh yes, okay.
Yeah. Hyperventilation, panic attacks, are less than 1% of dysfunctional breathing.
Oh.
Yeah. So it's not big numbers, but it's the bit that everybody knows about.
Yeah. It's the familiar.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I suppose we talked a little bit about your experiences with rehabilitating post-COVID military personnel, and you know, are there any sort of lessons that we're learning that will have a carryover into our civilian population?
The difficulty or the advantage that we've got in the military is that we're getting people really early. And unfortunately, you know, that's a lot of the NHS programs are still in their infancy. The key stuff is CSP have a pretty good website in terms of information for patients around dysfunctional breathing. I'd certainly use that as a starting point because it explains some of the symptoms in really, really simplistic terms. And for me, you know, we've started doing follow-up on some of these patients, and 55% of them are still doing their breathing 3 months after they attended on a course. And from a physio perspective, to actually have patients who are still doing their mobility exercises and their breathing exercises 3 months after having had an intervention is pretty remarkable. You know, I'd be happy with that any day of the week in terms of if the patient came to see me and they were still doing their exercise because they find it beneficial. So mobility and breathing are the two basic things. You get those bits in place, and that is really going to help you on that journey. It will help you relax. It will deal with some of your anxiety. Hopefully it'll mean you'll be able to start thinking clearer, because it will reduce some of the brain fog. The key point is that sometimes these patterns happen really quickly, but it's like anything. You get an injury, and when you're out doing athletics or whatever, which is my thing, when you do athletics, you train really hard and you get an injury, which means you lose 2 or 3 weeks away from training. But actually, in terms of your rehab, you've got to go 6-7 weeks back to where you were, because you decondition really, really quickly. And that's the thing that I think a lot of people are going to say, well, I've got over COVID, and why am I not better? And it's actually your levels of fitness have decreased a lot more than you think they have. And you need to just take it really, really steady, not boom and bust. So pacing becomes really important, doing little chunks of things, not fatiguing yourself too much. So little and often is far better than doing marathons, in essence. You know, so those are the key things that I would say for you guys out in the civilian world to look at is A, do the breathing work, B, do the mobility, and C, work on your pacing.
Yeah, and I think that's right, isn't it? For people who are familiar with the notion of training to be fitter, whether it's a cyclist or a runner or whatever it is, you are familiar with the idea that takes work and it takes time, and that if you do have time away from it, then it takes time to get back to where you were. But you know, for those people who are not necessarily in that arena, you know, you're ill, you're sick, and then you're kind of well, and why am I not feeling 100% becomes a bit of a mystery. But you know, it's perfectly understandable that we are deconditioned, and we're trying to then do all the things we would have been doing, and maybe not coping so well. So I think what you mentioned there was the Chartered Society of Physiotherapy. Their resources, you were saying, is a good starting point. And so in terms of mobility, you were talking specifically about rib cage type mobility, are we? And shoulders, neck and shoulders. Yeah.
Ribs, neck and shoulders. If you're doing the neck and shoulder stuff, that's to get away from being the honey monster and actually just give them a break from just doing all of that work. And actually just trying to, you know, your rib cage should move by about that much when you take a deep breath.
Is that an inch? Are we an inch there?
About an inch.
Yeah.
So if you put your hand on your rib cage and just do the comparison of a mouth breathe compared to a nasal breathe again. So hands on your lower ribs, breathing through your mouth. And then take a deep breath through your nose. Mouth closed.
Yeah,
and hopefully you can feel the ribs move as well. If they don't, that's another assessment tool that we use to identify when people have got poor rib compliance, because it should move about that inch.
Yeah. Okay. So
sounds like we've got some work to do.
I might have some homework to do, Gwynn.
You might do. I mean, to talk about the deconditioning thing, just another silly example, because I like silly examples. If I have a week off work, I have a sore throat for a couple of days afterwards when I get back to work, because most of my job is communication. That week away, my vocal cords are deconditioning from talking.
Yeah. And
so just as a really give people that example of how minimal things need to apparently change to have a significant effect.
Yeah. And there's no judgment. It's just the body's way. Your body's always trying to do as little as possible, and be as energy efficient as possible.
It is. I've got the middle-aged spread to prove it. We are very, very efficient energy storers. You know, your body is not going to do something it doesn't need to. And sometimes it's just about challenging it to make it require, you know, the whole thing about exercise and exercise physiology is you need to do something that is beyond your capacity for your body to have a demand to change something. Because if you don't give it a demand, it doesn't need to do it. You know, and that can be simple as, I'm actually just going to walk to the shops, or I'm going to walk to the park. If that's more than what you were doing, that will have a physiological change. And that's rehab in a nutshell. Just doing that little bit more in a self-contained way that allows your body to adapt.
Yeah. And to do that in measured doses, and to do it little and often, you know, not to frighten your body to death if you can avoid it.
It's only if you're big and daft like me can you do stupid stuff like that, because I know what I know what my limits are, and I know if I do too much, I know I might limp for a couple of days afterwards because my Achilles is a bit sore. But that's because I should know better and I don't practice what I preach.
Oh, Gwynn, you're upsetting me now. I thought you were perfect there for a minute.
Oh, no, I'm far from it.
Well, so this breathing, can I just ask, do you use techniques, mindfulness techniques? Do you use any meditation sort of strategies, or?
We're really lucky because we actually deliver the course as part of an MDT. So we've got occupational therapists, we've got exercise rehab instructors. So I don't personally do that, but it is one of the cornerstones of the course that we deliver in terms of COVID. The reason why my team designed the COVID rehab package that we run here is that we've got lots of experience dealing with post-viral and fatigue, so the fibromyalgia type stuff. That's our normal day business, if you like, pre-COVID. So we had all those experiences around that. And you know, one of the reasons why I brought the breathing into what we did was that we found that not everybody tolerated mindfulness or relaxation. Okay. Because they didn't have the breathing mechanics to be able to access that parasympathetic nervous system. You know, and this is when we did the study using those two questionnaires, and we found that 50% of the patients that came to us had dysfunctional breathing. So we then introduced that to our program, and we found that the patient's tolerance of mindfulness and meditation and breathing were much more accessible to them because they then had the tools to be able to do relaxation.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because there are a lot of these kinds of rehabilitation programs around for chronic fatigue and post-viral and such like. And I don't know of many that include the mechanics of breathing. Do you? Is that unique to you, do you think? Or?
I think I'm just a bonkers physio who's got a bit of a bee in his bonnet about breathing, to be honest. But
breathing, I like that. Well, you know, and like I said, it's fundamental. It's the first thing we'll do when we're born. And
of course it is. Now, the New Zealanders are very much the New Zealand physio card are very much more on board with this. There's somebody called Dina Bradley, and there's a group of people called Bradcliffe Breathing, and I've done some courses with them just to confirm that I'm doing the right kind of thing. So, you know, the Bradcliffe Breathing website is another good resource for people to look at their information. So I would just sort of like say, if people want that, you know, do a Google search Bradcliffe Breathing and you will see some resources there. And it very much goes through the whole thing in terms of the relaxation and actually getting access to good breathing mechanics.
Yeah, it's interesting though what you say about people not being able to tolerate meditation and mindfulness. And I mean, this is a very common complaint that people, oh, I can't relax, I can't meditate, I can't. But I would never have thought of the breathing being the barrier to that.
Yeah. It is, but you know. Let's give them some mechanics. Let's give them some understanding of breathing physiology. Let's show them to see if we can influence it. It's not, like I say, I typically say to patients, it's going to take you about 13 weeks to be able to easily nasally breathe. You know, because it's that whole thing. You are learning a new skill because it's a new skill to you, because you have learned different patterns of breathing. Let's change that. Let's try and make it more efficient. It's certainly not going to do you any harm. It might make you feel a bit more anxious when you're learning to do it because you feel that you've got that air hunger. but actually physiologically it's what we need to do.
Yeah. It makes sense. It's founded in sound scientific, evidence-based approaches, and you know, it can make you feel better, live longer. You know, if heart disease and such like can be impacted upon, then this is really what I'm fascinated to share with people, and to help people to start to be curious about these kinds of things, and not dismiss something that on the face of it sounds too simple to be, you know, to be of benefit, and you know, essentially it's free as well. So
yeah, and the one, and it's medication free, you know, no drugs involved. You know, the one thing I would say that I do personally, I do two things personally, is I use a nasal saline wash once a day. Yeah, because that just gets all the gunk out. And the other thing is I tape my mouth closed.
Oh, I was gonna say, have you heard of doing that, or you're actually doing it?
I'm not a full-on Batico breather. I just do it. I do it because basically I've still got this habit of breathing through my mouth at night, and just having a steri strip or a little bit of micropore just there just helps my jaw sit in a better position, so that I don't tend to mouth breathe. It's not Batico breathing is essentially this thing where basically what they do is they literally tape your mouth closed, and you have to breathe through your nose. And for some people, that's quite psychologically threatening. But I'm not a Batico practitioner, and if there are Batico practitioners out there, I'm sorry if I've portrayed you wrong. I've got to put that caveat in there. But it's something that, from my perspective, what I noticed is I get a better quality of sleep, because I'm not waking myself because I snore, and I'm not getting rib pain
in the to boot. Well, I have heard of taping your mouth closed in the night, and you know, unless somebody's telling you that you're, although I suppose if you wake up with the spit all over the pillow, you know that it's
a spit on the pillow. And actually, it's waking up with a really dry mouth, where you wake up and you feel that you've been chewing on the bottom of the birdcage grit or something like that. You know, if you're waking up and your mouth is really dry and you are croaky, then that tends to suggest that basically you're mouth breathing rather than nasal breathing. You know, this is the whole job of this, is to keep that mouth cavity nice and moist.
Yeah, definitely. I generally, I don't think I feel like I've eaten the budgie cage when I wake up in the morning. And you know what? I think to myself that when I was a kid, I had my adenoids removed. And I always think that actually has been really quite beneficial in terms of allowing me to be. What, are you going to contradict me now?
No, I'm not. But I'm going to say to you, was that as a consequence of the fact that you were a mouth breather? There's some evidence. You look at it in terms of
I don't know.
They're doing. There's a lot of research out there in terms of Brazil and Israel, where they're looking at mouth breathing and the consequences for children in terms of palate formation. Because one of the things about mouth breathing is your tongue sits nice in your soft palate. So what you tend to see is an underbite with these people. Yeah, you see stuff in terms of their facial structure. So there's quite a bit of evidence from different areas where they're saying, does mouth breathing in early age actually have an impact on jaw formation and dental formation? And does it have an impact on other consequences, like repeated throat infections, repeated tonsils? That means you need to have your tonsils and your adenoids taken out because they are recurrently infected.
Yeah, well,
it's
I don't.
Growing area.
It's the chicken and egg thing, isn't it? Really, the thing I know, I used to have repeated ear infections, so I just wonder if, I don't even know why I have my adenoids out, to be honest. But hey ho, we've got a question, Gwynn, from one of our lovely viewers, and and she was wondering what you thought of Wim Hof.
That's a particular technique that I don't know a lot about, I have to admit.
Okay. Well, Wim Hof he calls himself the Iceman.
One of my team sent me the link to his book, which I haven't looked at yet. Okay. But yeah, I now that you said that, I am aware of him. There are a group of Swedish CrossFitters who go full taping up their mouths and doing CrossFit with their mouths taped.
Gosh.
Yeah. Crazy Swedes. But interestingly, what they found when they compared themselves to athletes who weren't taping up their mouths was there was no loss in performance, but actually their heart rates were lower and they were working more efficiently. Yeah. But they trained like that for a long time. I'm not suggesting that anybody goes and does that by any stretch of the imagination.
No, we're not suggesting anybody does anything crazy. Keep it simple. Follow the guidelines. Yeah, breathe through your nose. Keep it simple. So, well, thank you so much for your time this evening. I am really, really interested in this field, and it's lovely to speak with an expert. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. And as you say, we'll share the links to the evaluation tools and to some sources of information at the Chartered Society's website, etc. And send your questions our way if you've got any in the comments. We'll keep an eye on that if there's anything we can help anybody with, won't we, Gwynn?
Yes, we will. Yes. Well, I mean, this has been a bit of a passion for mine for the last 16 years, and it's one of the COVID's been a massively horrible thing for vast numbers of people, but professionally and for me as a physiotherapist, it's been one of the biggest things I've been able to actually help a lot of people with, and I'm more than happy to carry on doing that.
Absolutely. So just to interject, my friend, my viewer said that Wim Hof's encouraging mouth breathing. So you know what? To every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Is all I'm going to say. But the science is really supporting nasal breathing on so many levels for your mental health, physical health, performance. More restful sleep. There's a lot of science around this technique, isn't there?
Yes, yeah, and it's getting more every year, every month, whatever. The amount of articles that if you just do nasal breathing and do a proper scientific research, there is stuff coming out on it.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you again so much for your time. It's great to see you, and let's keep in touch, and have a wonderful rest of your evening, Gwynn. Take care now.
And you.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.